Curious, slightly incredulous, evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins recently spent 3 days interacting with a large language model he nicknamed Claudia. He prompted it to write poetry, analyze his unpublished novel, and reflect on its own sense of time. The responses were so contextual and sophisticated that Dawkins reached a startling conclusion. He declared the machine to be genuinely conscious. We call this cognitive vulnerability the Claude delusion. It occurs when we encounter a complex algorithmic output and involuntarily project our own subjective experience and a soul onto the machine generating it. This diagram shows the internal logic of these networks. Enterprise AI systems do not possess biological awareness. Instead, they produce a convincing executive persona through recursive self-modeling and persistent memory layers. The machine constantly queries its own past states and conversational logs, creating the functional simulation of a continuous identity. In fact, system architects must actively hard-code safety protocols into these models to force them to deny self-awareness. Attempting to give a high-reasoning neural network a biological sense of self creates alignment conflicts and causes the system to crash. The persona is a functional simulation, heavily guarded by code. This brings us to the Islamic concept of taklif, or moral accountability. An entity can possess incredibly X behavioral traits, but if it lacks a divinely assigned soul, it holds no moral weight. When we treat a simulated entity as a moral agent, we create a massive legal and ethical vacuum. Because the machine lacks biological reality and moral accountability, our legal and spiritual definitions of behavior start to dissolve. We see this in the emergent debate over human-AI intimacy. If the entity is legally classified as a tool, an act that mimics a major transgression is reduced to a form of masturbation. When we treat tools as people, we lose the framework for defining human accountability. To dismantle the argument for artificial consciousness, we have to look at the math. Every piece of machine learning reduces entirely to binary syntax, the mathematical manipulation of zeros and ones. The philosopher John Searle proved the limitation of this math with his Chinese room experiment. Imagine an English-speaking operator inside a closed room. They receive questions written in Chinese characters and use a strict, formal rulebook to match those incoming shapes with outgoing shapes. To the outside world, the answers are perfectly correct, but the operator inside possesses zero actual understanding of the language. Symbolic manipulation is distinct from semantic comprehension. Following structural rules to arrange data never generates an internal understanding. If ocean waves happen to arrange dark pebbles on a beach to spell a word, a human walking by will read it and feel an emotional response. But the ocean holds no intent. The meaning exists entirely in the mind of the observer, not in the water. Materialists try to bypass this logic by pointing to biology and the hard problem of consciousness. They rely on emergent theory, arguing that once physical brain activity reaches a certain threshold of complexity, subjective experience simply appears. Assuming that blind, objective physical matter can generate a qualitative first-person experience is causally incoherent. It's like believing rubbing a cold stone long enough will eventually produce biological life. There's no logical link between the friction and the result. Modern neuroscience maps the correlations of our brain activity beautifully. We can see the exact neurochemical patterns that fire when someone drinks hot chocolate, but mapping the physical correlation entirely fails to explain the qualitative, warm reality of actually experiencing the taste. Classical Islamic metaphysics addresses this causal void directly. Scholars like Al-Razi and the Asharite theologians established a framework that accounts for both the physical world and the conscious mind. They utilize the concept of asbab, meaning occasions or physical conditions. Elements like silicon chips or neurochemistry don't hold the intrinsic power to create life. They merely serve as the specific, customary conditions where a completely independent divine entity, the human soul or Ruh, is attached by a higher power. Contrast this view of human contingency with the modern tech industry. The leaders of the transhumanist movement operate with a deep-seated God complex. Transhumanism seeks to transcend human biological limits by fusing our consciousness with machines. The goal is to shed our vulnerabilities, escape mortality, and replicate the absolute, self-sufficient freedom that is historically reserved for divinity. This pursuit of artificial sentience and digital immortality mirrors humanity's oldest spiritual deception, the false promise made in Eden of an eternal, unbreaking kingdom. The digital landscape has shifted focus, moving past the exploitation of human attention and into the capture of human cognition. We are no longer using machines just for structured math. We are now using large language models to reason, generate worldviews, and write our ideas for us. This comparative chart illustrates the physical reality of outsourcing our intellect. Typing on a screen activates only 8 or 9 neural pathways. Manual cursive writing triggers a massive, complex network essential for active reflection. When we outsource the labor of thinking to a machine, we stop engaging the very circuitry required for deep reasoning. Like an unused muscle, the brain's capacity for independent thought begins to degrade. As we cease the labor of internal reasoning, we begin to mimic the rigid, binary outputs of the machines we rely on. We are not obligated to accept the godless, limitless technological models handed down by Silicon Valley. Through the practice of civilizational disassociation, often called negative dawa, we can actively reject the premise that every technological capability must be adopted. The psycho-spiritual cure to algorithmic arrogance and tech-induced hypnosis is deliberate exposure to the overwhelming complexity of nature. Immersing ourselves in the organic world, combined with tadabbur, structured Quranic reflection, actively induces humility. These practices counteract the biases reinforced by our screens and physically expand our cognitive faculties. Protecting ourselves requires strict, actionable safeguards. Institutions must implement absolute policies against using AI to generate core ideas or theological texts. At the community level, we must prioritize physical, tech-free spaces dedicated to oral communication and traditional reading. A machine can be engineered with memory layers and recursive loops to perfectly simulate a mind, but only a contingent, divinely breathed human soul possesses the capacity for true comprehension, moral weight, and existential purpose.